Thank you. Thank you all very much for staying. So I'm not going to do a dance. I'm sorry, I can't really do a dance. It's not my style. Have you all got a stiff drink? Because you're gonna need it by the end of this talk, okay? Because what I want to do is to talk to you about the future of politics. And in the same way that I guess your industries are being transformed by digital technology, obviously politics is being transformed in the same way. And just like in your industries, no one's ever been fired for buying IBM, but it's often the great weird innovators, the fringe groups, the people that everybody else says are completely mad that come to define the future of an industry. So I think the same is true in politics. And what I want to do is to take you on a short journey with 3 different political movements that I think have and will shape the future of politics, and who are taking technology and the things that you've been hearing about today and using it to reimagine, to re-engineer how politics looks. This is part of the work that I always do. I have this strange obsession with trying to understand how fringe movements, the weird groups on the edges of society, very often are a clue as to how the future might look. In my 2014 book about the darknet, I wrote a lot about Bitcoin and how everybody should buy Bitcoin. I mean, I didn't do that myself, obviously, which is why I'm here now, because but it was a really good example, actually, of the way in which a very small group of crypto-anarchists in an obscure cryptography forum in 2009 invented something that everybody else thought was ridiculous and wouldn't work, and just 5 years later suddenly becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so over the course of the last couple of years while writing this book, Radicals, I basically spent my time embedded in these fringe movements. And the reason I did that was partly because of this terrifying chart. This is where you take your first swig of your drink. Because what this graph shows, it was a survey that was conducted a couple of years ago asking people whether they thought it was essential to live in a democracy. And then they broke the results down by decade of birth. So people that were born in the 1930s, people in their 80s or even their 90s, high proportions of those people, 70, 80%, think it's essential to live in a democracy. Every decade you move forward, with a couple of exceptions, that number goes down. So people born in the 1980s, only 20, 30, 40% of people think it's essential to live in a democracy. No one knows exactly why this is. I note that Sweden's doing pretty well. You know, you can feel happy with yourselves that actually, you know, we're all right. We're not so bad. We're not as bad as the UK, definitely not. But the direction of travel is the same. There is something of a crisis in democracy. People don't trust in the way that politics works very well. And there's a great opening for new ideas, for new ways of doing democracy. And that's where these innovators, these fringe groups come in. And so I spent my time trying to think, what are the new ideas in politics that might really change and shape the future? And I'm going to give you 3 of them. And I'm going to start with this guy, Beppe Grillo. Do you know who he is? He's an Italian. Well, he's actually recently stepped down, but the very frustrating thing about writing a book about fringe politics at the moment is between the time I started and the time I finished, some of my fringe movements were already mainstream movements. That's how quick, I'd have to rename the book. But that's how fast politics seems to be moving at the moment. But Beppe Grillo is a really good example of how to disrupt the mass party model in Italy. In 2009, he was a famous blogger, famous comedian, and he decided to set up a new political movement called the 5 Star Movement. And in the most recent Italian election, the 5 Star Movement, so only 7 or 8 years on, well, I say won the election. I mean, you can never really tell if anyone wins an election in Italy. I don't think it quite works like that, but they were the largest single party in Italy. And the way they did it was it's a really good example, I think, of how politics at a very basic level is going to be transformed by digital technology. In 2009, he says, we don't need political parties anymore. There's this big bureaucracy, this hierarchy, it's outdated. We had representative democracy where we elect these people and for 5 years they make decisions on our behalf. We don't need that anymore. Now we have digital technology. Each of us is going to be able to directly make decisions, like an Athenian direct democracy where everybody can vote on every single thing that happens. And in a sense, he was reflecting the great optimism of the 1990s when people said, when we're all digitally connected up and when everybody has information about everybody else and every subject, we'll all be far more informed and our politics will be far more thoughtful and it'll be far kinder because there'll be no more misunderstanding. I mean, you don't need to be a great cynic to think that that might not be quite how things have worked out. But Beppe Grillo is a fantastic example of the difficulties, the wonderful opportunities and difficulties that this technology brings. So he says, I'm going to set up a blog, and everybody gets to vote on every single vote that our MPs take in the parliament. Every member of the party can have a plebiscite on my blog instructing them about how to vote. And suddenly people thought this was fantastic. Thousands upon thousands of Italians suddenly got involved in politics again, thinking this is a different way of doing things. He said that every single local branch can elect their own member from amongst their own membership base and put them up for election. We're not going to have this party system list where a couple of people at the top run everything. And suddenly they have this huge breakthrough because there's so much cynicism in Italian politics, understandably, that they think this is a new way of doing things. Thousands of people who were never involved in politics before get involved in the Five Star Movement. They start knocking on doors, they start running for parliament, they obviously vote in huge numbers, and it's transformed the way that Italian politics looks in under a decade. It's a remarkable story. And I think as more and more of us see this disconnection between our daily lives as consumers, where we have everything we want in the way we want it, when we want it, how we want it, and our politics, which seems so slow and so muddling and full of compromise, this type of politics becomes more and more successful, more and more appetizing for people. However, the problem, of course, is that Beppe Grillo is also an incredibly rude individual. He is argumentative. He insults his opponents. He calls Silvio Berlusconi a psychopathic dwarf. Now, whether you think that's true or not is a different question. It's not a nice way of doing politics. His Five Star Movement, they often refuse to work with other people. Some of them have got into fistfights with members of the opposition. So this is politics which is very inclusive. It brings people in. It's wonderful for that. But it's also making politics far more argumentative, far more oppositional, in many ways far more tribal. And Beppe Grillo, in a sense, is the perfect politician for the social media age because his jokes and his insults, this is what any advertiser would tell you is sticky content. This is the stuff that people share. It's funny. It goes viral in a way that the boring mainstream politicians really struggle to do. So for the good things and the bad things, ladies and gentlemen, may I suggest that this may be the future of politics in a digital age. So that's just a question of how the formal political system works. But I want to show you some slightly more out there stories. And I'm going to show you one in particular. Is there anyone in here who's a transhumanist? No, I didn't think there would be. No, you don't. Well, what is a transhumanist is probably the first question. Transhumanism is a movement that of people who think that we can and should use science and technology to radically improve the human condition. So we should use artificial intelligence to transform our economy so we don't have to do boring, monotonous work. We can invest huge amounts of money in life extension technology so we can all live for much longer. Essentially, we've gone through phases of evolution before, and the next phase of evolution is working with technology to upgrade the species. Transhumanism. And for a very long time, I mean, the inventor of artificial intelligence, Marvin Minsky, is a very famous transhumanist. One of Google's chief scientists, Ray Kurzweil, is a famous transhumanist. But for a very long time, this was quite a niche movement, a small movement of people. And in 2015, this guy gets in touch with me. He's a transhumanist, and he says, I want to bring the message of radical technological upgrade to the American people. It's too niche, it's too academic, but I think the masses need to understand that big change is coming to society, that artificial intelligence is going to rip through our economies, and we need to be ready for it. We need to change how our social systems work. Life extension technology, this is possible. We need to start wondering how we're going to live in a world where people could live for 120, 130, 150 years. So he said, I'm going to run for president in the 2016 US presidential election. Disclaimer, you don't need to buy my book. He didn't win the election. Some other radical guy won the election. But he gets in touch with me, and his name is, believe it or not, his name is Zoltan, which is actually his name, and it's a perfect name for a transhumanist. And he raises $25,000 to crowd-funded money, naturally enough, to ride a 30-foot-long bus that looks like a coffin on wheels across America to bring the message of transhumanism to the people. And I'm going to show you the 1-minute video he sent me explaining what it is that he would be doing.
Hi, my name is Zoltan Ishvan, and I'm the 2016 U.S. presidential candidate of the Transhumanist Party, and I am going to be driving a 40-foot coffin bus across America promoting transhumanism and life extension. It's something that's going to work. It's something that's going to wake up America and get people thinking that perhaps we don't have to die. Perhaps we can use science and technology to overcome our biological mortality. The Immortality Bus is a wild idea to traverse the United States, hopefully getting people to think about using science and technology to overcome aging, to overcome death, and to embrace transhumanism. We're going to have campaign drones, we're going to have a robot, we're going to have virtual reality gear on board, we're going to hopefully have a biohacking lab on board. I mean, it's going to be crazy fun stuff. Please support the Immortality Bus, please support my campaign, and let's hope this 40-foot coffin bus can turn into a big success and really get people thinking about how we can use science and technology better in our lives.
So obviously when I see that video, the only thing I really wanted to do with my life was to be on that bus with that man. And so I traveled over to California, to San Francisco in late 2015, and indeed there was a big coffin bus on wheels called the Immortality Bus. Does it look like a coffin to you? I mean, kind of, yeah. See that casket thing on the top? He'd nailed that on because it's meant to make it look like a coffin, but he'd nailed over the air conditioning ventilation system, and warned us that if we turned, it was 110 degrees in Nevada, and he warned us that if we turned the air conditioning on, there was a good possibility that we might actually get carbon dioxide poisoning and die, which would have been a real nice irony on the Immortality Bus. But we survived. But I'm not going to tell you everything that happened, but he traveled all the way across the United States on this bus, trying to bring this message of how science and technology can change our lives. But a couple of quick and interesting highlights. The first was that although he'd promised all these wonderful things on the bus, VR headsets and drones and robots and da-da-da-da-da. In the end, what it actually was just an empty bus full of journalists, because journalists, myself included, loved the idea of telling the story of a man promising immortality on a 1977 Wanderlodge RV bus. It was just too good to be true for us journalists. So the whole bus was constantly full of one transhumanist and about 10 journalists covering the story, which created a very, very strange, but I hope recognizable dynamic. For example, when we went to buy some paint to touch up the Immortality bus writing in the hardware store, a very boring thing to do, Zoltan was, of course, being followed by 2 camera crews and 3 journalists with notepads, which meant people would stop him and say, "Who are you? Are you famous?" And he would say, "Well, I am the candidate for the Transhumanist Party for the US election." And they'd say, "Well, that's interesting. What does that mean?" And he would explain, and us journalists would write it down, and then we'd file our stories about interactions with the public that only happened because we journalists were there. And it's a strange dynamic that I think is happening more and more in politics, that journalists are kind of creating the movements that they're writing about. But here's a strange thing that happened on about day 5 or 6. We got to Central California and we went to a biohacking lab. This, I think, is a fascinating and important new movement of people who are experimenting with trying to essentially put bits of technology in their own bodies. One of the most popular things is to put RFID chips under the skin, inside your skin. And most people will have an RFID chip in one way or another. Typically, your pet cat will have one round its neck so you can trace it, or you might have a fob key to get in and out of your office. RFID chips are only the size of a grain of sand. It's a grain of salt, a grain of rice, so they're quite easy to put inside your skin. And this was in someone's basement where Zoltan decides he's going to have an RFID chip implant so that he can unlock his mobile phone automatically just by doing that, by touching the RFID chip. Brilliant. That's him getting it done. The only problem was that Zoltan's chip was programmed to work on an iPhone, and he didn't tell them that he had a Samsung phone, so it didn't even work. This is one of the things about technology and politics sometimes. You can make the most grandiose promises about total transformation of the world, and yet then the basics aren't done correctly. Anyway, he traveled all the way across America. And my goodness me, did he get picked up by a lot of journalists. Journalists love this guy. The BBC covered him. Der Spiegel covered it. The Guardian wrote a long feature about it. The Verge, the Daily Mail, the New Yorker magazine, the famous New Yorker magazine, did a big feature about Zoltan. Salon. And the thing is about it, he got more coverage from journalists than almost anybody else apart from the main 2 candidates. All of them reported the story in exactly the same way, that he was the transhumanist candidate for the Transhumanist Party running for the election. I went and looked into this in a bit more detail, and it turned out that there was no such thing as the Transhumanist Party. It was a total fabrication. It didn't exist as a legal entity. Now, that might not sound like a big deal to you, but Zoltan was breaking US election law by raising money for a political party that didn't actually exist. He was running as an independent candidate, which anyone can do. And I think about 80 people voted for him in the end, just wrote his name in the ballot. So not really very many people at all. But he raised awareness. This is the strange thing about Zoltan. He raised awareness about questions that I think are going to become defining political questions in the next 10 years. How do we restructure society if we have ever-improving smart machines that will do more and more types of work? So types of work won't be necessary. We'll come up with other jobs. Some of the ludicrous speculation about millions of unemployed people is ridiculous, but there's going to be turbulence as we shift into a different type of economy. How do we make sure that the losers from that transition are helped to make the jump? Zoltan has suggestions. He has ideas. What happens when life extension technology, which is improving at a remarkable speed, does actually start to affect the budgets that our treasuries put together for social security spending, or health spending, or social care spending? We need to start thinking about these questions politically, because I don't know if you've felt this, but the last couple of years has seemed like it's been a bit of a technology backlash. People are getting sort of frustrated, fearful, not sure where it's taking society. And it's very important that we make sure that we spread the gains and benefits of this technological revolution so people don't reject it. And people like Zoltan are trying to come up with ideas about how we do that. Now, once you... the kind of message of his story, and I think of so many others, is that a lot of what he says is completely ridiculous and silly. But there's usually some grain of truth in there if you actually listen to it. And it's often the case with these fringe movements. They seem weird, they seem impossible, they seem mad. Then suddenly society starts to change, and some of the things they said turned out to actually be quite visionary after all. And that's why they're worth listening to and paying attention to. And that's the story with Zoltan. By the way, he's currently running to become the Libertarian governor of California. So keep an eye out for him. Final story is about the way that even the nature of the nation itself might be changing with technology. This is even further down the line than transhumanism. Has anyone heard of this country before, Liberland? All right, a couple of you have. Yeah, it's the world's newest country. Here it is. It's on the border between Serbia and Croatia. So the Danube River, you can see there, splits up Croatia and Serbia. And Liberland is that 7 square kilometer red patch in the middle of the screen. And Liberland is disputed territory for a very, very strange reason. Because Croatia says that Liberland belongs to Serbia, and Serbia says that Liberland belongs to Croatia, which I believe is the first time that's ever happened in the history of international diplomacy. Just so you know why that is, it's because after the Croatian War of Independence from Serbia, the default border was set at the Danube River. Serbia's happy with that border. Croatia is not happy with that border. It thinks that the correct border should be the 19th century course of the Danube, which is that black line, which would put about 50 square kilometers of Serbia into Croatia, but would put that little red bit into Serbia. So both countries claim it belongs to the other, which means that it's technically known as terra nullius in international law, land that is unclaimed by a sovereign nation state, which is a very, very rare thing indeed. And according to international law, you're not going to believe this, the first person that turns up and sticks a flag in the ground gets to claim sovereignty over it. Which in 2015, this guy does, and that's the president of Liberland, Vít Jedlička. He's a Czech libertarian who's obsessed with cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, but also blockchain technologies more generally, and who says the whole nature of governments, these big, bulky, hulking, centralized bureaucracies, they were built in another era. They were built in the 19th century, when governments really could control things. They could control the money supply. They could control the flow of information. They could control the flow of people. But that's changing now. The nature of modern technology is that it's much harder for governments to control things. Certainly in democracies, in liberal democracies, it's getting harder and harder for governments to control things. And we don't want big centralized governments anymore. We want small city-states that are libertarian in principle. They'll be far more agile. That's the model of the future. So he travels to Liberland, he sticks his flag in the ground, declares himself president, writes a constitution, and it's a libertarian constitution. I mean, we're talking voluntary taxation, which, is very, very popular Voluntary taxation. No restrictions whatsoever on what you can say or do or put in your body or what you can possess, firearms, whatever you want. Anyone can become a citizen from anywhere in the world and set their blockchain-based business up and register it on a blockchain, but register it inside a Liberland. Bitcoin is going to be the official currency of this new place. And he says this is the future. Croatia gets very annoyed about this immediately. Shuts the border down, stops anyone from getting into Liberland. And that is why when I went to the 1-year founding anniversary of Liberland with 50 or 100 of the world's leading libertarians, we couldn't do it in Liberland. We had to do it over here in Croatia, in Osijek, because the police wouldn't let us in. Now, the strangest thing about countries and nation states, and I'd never really thought about any of this before, is that the whole thing, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, the whole thing is basically a cartel that's run by the United Nations. I mean, to become a new country, you have to get other members of the nation-state club to agree that you are a nation-state, and then you can become one. And so VIT and the thousands upon thousands of people who have now signed up to become Liberland citizens have decided the best way of proceeding is to basically pretend that Liberland's already a country, and then try to get other countries to recognize it as such. So when I get into their big conference, it's in the kind of room about the same size as this one. It is full of people who are pretending like they are already a nation state. We have the treasurer, the Ministry of Finance. The Minister for Finance is giving a long talk about the revenue for Liberland, the taxation levels for Liberland for the year 21-22, which isn't very much because there's voluntary taxation, so we're not going to have much government spending. They have about 150 representatives from around the world that are lobbying their own governments to try to recognize this place. They have clever swish brochures. They have an air traffic controller. They have a football team. They have a national wine. They have a national beer. And when I was there, they were even awarding the prizes for some of the architectural sort of competitions that were going on for how Liberland would look in the future, which is, here's some of the entries. I mean, it's like Blade Runner or something like that, isn't it? And that one on the top is, I think that was the winner. It's like an algae-powered, super efficient city. It actually looks like this at the moment. So, I mean, it's not, we're not quite there. But, is it possible that one day maybe we will get to something like this? I'm not entirely sure, I don't know. But the truth of history, I think, is this, that it has always been those people on the fringes, the ones that have the energy, the enthusiasm, the mild sense of madness that is necessary to keep fighting for new ideas, to keep pushing and promoting a set of ideas that other people say will never work. The new ideas, I mean, surely we can all agree that as society transforms, our politics will have to transform too. We're going through this great transition in our economies and our social lives, our economic lives. Politics will have to change. It can't just stay as it is now. It hasn't really changed for a very long time. Where are these ideas going to come from about the future? These exciting, bold, visionary ideas, they're not going to come from me, and they're not going to come from the rest of the mainstream. They're going to come from people like this. And some of them are going to be scary and terrifying. Some of them are going to be fantastic and exciting, because it's the people that can imagine a future that's different that will be the ones that end up building it. And so my one sort of takeaway thing to you is those radicals, those fringe groups in politics that you see and discard and dismiss, you can laugh at them, you can do whatever you want, you can say they're mad, but you must never ignore them, because sometimes they might actually be right. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jamie. This was really interesting. Are there any questions for Jamie? Just raise your hand. You know the drill. We've been doing this all day. Okay, then what happens? I get to go first. Do you think that technology has really changed our behavior, or is it just, the platforms that has changed?
I think it has changed our behavior. It's very hard to know exactly how, but I think it's a somewhat lazy argument to say humans are humans, we've always done this, we've always been mean, or we've always been nasty, or we've always been nice, and this is simply the same behavior expressed on a different platform. But the platforms we have shape the sorts of behavior that we display. I mean, there's all sorts of things now that people are able to do, simply put, that they would not have been able to do before. And some people will do that for good reasons and some will bad. I mean, to give you an example, in my other book about the darknet, I can't sometimes reflect on the fact that when I was 13 years old, I got in trouble for stealing do you remember WWF, the World Wrestling thing, that America with Hulk Hogan and all those people? It's really huge in the UK, and I got in trouble because I was an accomplice to somebody that stole one of those little figurines from one of our local shops. Oh, God, I got in so much trouble. It was my one brush with the law. It never happened again. But now, that was the extent of my criminal capabilities. Now, unfortunately, it is incredibly easy to commit quite serious cyber fraud. I mean, credit card fraud on the darknet is a very, very easy thing to do. And I know of teenagers who are the same age as me when I did that with the figurine, who are getting involved in credit card fraud, not really understanding quite how serious it is. And so, in that way, the behavior has changed because certain types of behavior have been facilitated. And when certain things are easier or harder, more people do them or less people do them. And so, it's not about people suddenly becoming more evil or more nasty, but the balance changes about the sorts of incentives people have to do certain things. Yeah. And so that's how I tend to approach it.
And like you said, we are not nicer on the internet, for example, than we are on the contrary, maybe.
Yeah, yes. I mean, there's again quite a lot of studies about what happens under the conditions of anonymity. I mean, anybody who is driving in a car, we used to do this driving in a car and someone would drive past us and you were kind of acting in the same way as you are online because you're quasi-anonymous there and you're shouting and screaming. And some of it is, I think, this belief that everyone's got nastier is partly that. It's partly that it's easier to just say things that you don't really mean or believe and just shout them on the internet. And partly that we can now collect it and analyze it. I mean, when you read studies about the levels of hate crime on the internet, some of it is simply that we've datafied that. Like, oftentimes it would be that you wouldn't be able to measure those things. And I think the equivalent of people being mean on Twitter is rather more similar to you shouting at the television at people you don't like the political commentator that you hate on TV and shouting at them. Imagine if there was a camera in every single household in Sweden recording every time somebody in their home shouted at the television. We would be saying, oh my God, an epidemic of hate and anger and rage. Yeah. But we can measure it now. So I think there's a separate level here about how we're measuring and understanding social problems that's very different to how we did 10 years ago.
Last chance for a question to Jamie. Yes, go ahead.
Of Liberland. Yes, I am a citizen of Liberland. I mean, I haven't done anything with that yet. I'm not planning to move there. But one of the chief... this is one of the reasons I think that places like Liberland are very interesting. And there's an awful lot of investment at the moment in how can you build entire country-level services on the internet. So when I spent a lot of time in Liberland, I also spent a lot of time on this thing called BitNation, which is like a blockchain-based country trying to create contract law between people via immutable blockchain contracts. And I'm also a citizen of BitNation as well. But one of the reasons these things I think are really interesting is all of their money that they've been getting for the last 5 or 6 years has been in cryptocurrencies. I mean, Vit Jedlicka, the president of Liberland, for the last 5 years, he's been receiving $10,000 in Bitcoin, in donations, from one guy called Roger Ver, who's a huge Bitcoin millionaire. He gets donations from all over the world. But just one guy's been giving him $10,000 in Bitcoin every single... Did I say a year? I meant to say a month. Every single month, which is worth so much money now. And there's this interesting dynamic when it comes to cryptocurrencies, I think, which is as the value of it's gone up, the people that love the technology are getting richer, so they're able to invest more in applications of that technology, which means more and more people want to start trying to buy it and get interested in it, which means those people are richer again. And that is kind of what's happening here with these guys. So I am a citizen of Liberland. Roger Ver, who's invested all that money, has said that the minute the Croatian government recognizes the right of Liberland to exist, he's going to move over there, roll his sleeves up and start digging and making this place actually come to fruition. Here's the weird thing. Liberland is based in Slavonia, which is a region of Croatia, which is one of the poorest in Europe. 15 people leave that region every single day. Unemployment levels in that region among under 25s is like 45 or 50%. And these guys are like, we have millions of dollars to invest in this Hong Kong on the Danube. Why won't you let us try? And when I see it that way, I think it's a really exciting possibility. Yeah, it might fail, but we'll definitely learn something from that failure. So I weirdly hope, even though I'm no libertarian, I weirdly hope they're given the chance to try to see what they can do with it.
You should always try.
You should always try.
Yeah.
You should always try.
Jamie, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.